As Dick said, I'm Coastal Officer at the County Council. I'm pleased to be here to tell you a bit about our work on the Shoreline Management Plan. I'm going to start off, however, with a bit of background about the Essex coast, just to show some of the issues we had to consider in developing the plan, then run into some of the different aspects which we had to consider in arriving at the policies. Then Andrew's going to take over from that point, looking at actual coastal contaminated sites and looking at potential action moving forward. I'm sure a number of you might be aware already, but Essex is located on the east of the country, just northeast of London. This slide actually shows slightly different boundaries to the previous one, because this is the SMP boundary, which includes elements of South Suffolk and down to Two Tree Island in the south on the Thames estuary. You can see there's quite an extensive creek and estuary structure system there, which makes our coastline one of the longest in the country at 350 miles or thereabouts, so quite a complex system to manage, and very varied in the uses which are undertaken there and which we've had to consider in developing the SMP. So some of those quite standard around a number of the different areas of the coast, I'm sure, but we've got some highly populated coastal towns such as Clacton here. We've got issues there with the beach being lost due to coast erosion, with a significant structure potentially being undermined. We've got more rural towns such as Malden with historic heritage aspects, and traditional sailing, land-based, water-based recreation, and which is obviously significant for the local tourism economy. Industry, we look at both aspects, old and new. We've got Bradwell Nuclear Power Station, which is in the process of being decommissioned, and then we look at the new emerging technologies associated with wind energy generation, along with fishing, obviously, and agriculture. Then, as other people have talked about, the importance to consider environmental aspects. We've got one of the most highly designated coastlines in the country. We've got 9 special protection areas and one significantly sized special area of conservation, designated under the Birds Directive and Habitats Directive, respectively. And all of these have to be considered when you're looking at shoreline management options. These 2 slides both look at rural locations with the seawalls there, with the borrow dikes behind. However, we've obviously got some significant areas that have hard defences also. So over to the Shoreline Management Plan. As a number of you will be aware already, this plan is looking to manage flood and coastal erosion risk for a 100-year period. So we had to divide that extensive Essex coastline, or Essex and South Suffolk coastline, into policy development zones, and there were over 90 of those we had to consider. For each of 3 epochs, so for 20-year, 50-year and 100-year time frames. For each of those, and for each of those time epochs, we had to look at one of 4 policies which would be most appropriate, taking into consideration some of the issues on the next slide, which will help to inform policy. But the policies we had to select were between advance the line, which would only be used really very rarely for things like port expansion, where you actually move the sea defence seaward and encompass some more land. Hold the line, which is good in theory to hold the existing line of defence, but there's no guarantee of funding to be able to do that. Managed realignment, where you might move the seawall. You might either you slow the rate of erosion, or by putting a structure in front. That was one form of managed realignment we had. Others were making a break in the sea defence to either create new habitat, but certainly to alleviate some flood risk further downstream. And then no active intervention was the other policy, where, as the name would suggest, you don't actually undertake any positive management. So various policy considerations were taken into, gone through. Paramount was the protection of people and property. And then we looked at the estimated unmaintained life of defences, which I'll look at in the next slide, and coastal processes which were exerted on each of the different policy development zones. And this is then where it was this looking at the overriding constraints which brought me and Andrew together, because we looked at the waste elements around the site and the potential issues there might be with those. We also considered the economics along with the Habitats Directive and potential compensatory measures. So we looked, as I mentioned earlier, at the estimated unmaintained defence life, and I don't know if you can see the key on the right-hand side of the slide, which it broke down into different colour bands, whether each of the seawalls was expected to last for, how long it was expected to last for, if there was no further maintenance actually undertaken on the defence in question. So that was ground truth by stakeholders as part of the consultation exercise. And that highlighted obviously areas of vulnerability, and that was then overlaid with coastal processes data, where we looked at particular stretches where the red triangles showed high areas of erosion, and the green crosses indicated areas of accretion. So you could begin to look at which seawalls might be sustainable to maintain into the longer term and which might not, therefore knowing whether potentially we'd be able to find the funding to hold the line or whether we wouldn't. And in some areas, I'll try and make this pointer work, such as over here, you'll notice the constraints there of the refuse-filled defence. Andrew's going to go along and talk about that in a little bit next. But that, as you can see, is an area of sort of quite a lot of pressure on that through coastal processes. And really we had to look, there was a constraint. We would have looked to maybe put a realignment in there, but we were constrained by doing so because of the waste issue. So we've had to actually put in a potential for a site opposite to alleviate pressures on that particular stretch of the river. But that has higher, more significant historic environment things which we stand to lose. So we're looking at that. We've got a potential realignment there in the third epoch on the opposite bank. And it's those sort of considerations which brought Andrew and I together. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew to talk you through a bit more of the waste issue.
Thanks, Nicky. As Nicky said, we brought together, Nicky was asking for details of the landfills we had on the various coastal sites that she had identified. And in terms of Essex County Council sites, these are the ones we had. We had some normal landfill sites that were just near to the coast. We also had some seawalls actually made out of waste. The information, the quality and quantity of information on these sites was varied. Some of them we had a lot of information, others we didn't have much at all. This is a map showing those sites more sort of graphically, and we've basically got sites running from a range of a few 100,000 cubic metres of waste up to one in the north there, that's got 2.5 million cubic waste in it. So we've got varied problems at each one. The sort of information that we could produce, I can sort of demonstrate using the Fambridge Seawall project. It was built in the mid to late 80s and with a joint project with the National Rivers Authority, which obviously is now the Environment Agency. Various seawalls in Essex were built using waste under the Land Drainage Act 1976. They were constructed using domestic, commercial and light industrial non-hazardous waste. So mid-80s waste of that sort of characterisation gives an idea of what we may be facing in the future. This is South Fambridge Seawall, 2.5 miles long, 50 metres wide, average waste depth 4 metres. So it takes a bit of time to monitor, it's quite a lot of walking. It's not just a quick round in a circle. That's basically a cross-section of what we did there. This is the original sea defence. We added waste behind it to strengthen it, and we raised the height as well. The ditch behind the borrow ditch basically was dug to wind materials to cap and cover the site. So there's seawall being constructed. You can see the waste going in there, and the sort of plant and machinery that was used. That's the finished item. Got the river crouch, obviously the tidal river crouch that side, and then the borrow ditch that side. This has been seeded probably in the first year since its construction. It's now used for agriculture. There's mainly sort of hay crops, things like that on there. That's obviously the tidal side of the seawall where it's been strengthened with concrete blocks. That was all done at the time of construction, so that's the state of it around now. We've got public access to them, footpaths, agriculture, as I said, and some of the landfills are actually public open space or country parks now. The landfills are, as they're sort of historical landfills, they're unlicensed, but we do monitor them as almost as though they were licensed, just to make sure that we're conforming to the contaminated land legislation, etc. We monitor the surface water quality on the seawalls and the borrow ditches to make sure nothing's leaching out, and landfill gas migration. Where appropriate, we have got some properties near some of our sites. This is not a waste-filled seawall, but it is just downstream from our Fambridge one that we just looked at. So that focuses our attention a little bit of what might be happening and what we may face in the future. You can obviously imagine what that would look like from pictures we've seen already if there was waste behind there. Going forward, using the Syria guidance and what we've learnt from this exercise, we need to know a bit more about the structural integrity of our sea defences, whether it's going to be 10, 50, 100 years of where we may face something like that previous slide. We need to know the nature of the waste involved. We obviously know what sort of stuff went in, but we don't know what it looks like now. Has it still got the potential to cause us problems? Would we be able to not worry about it if it got eroded away like that previous slide? We have to look at the possible, the effect of the seawater tidal movement within the waste. If water's going up and down inside the waste, is it just flushing the contaminants out and making it more stable more quickly? We also may look at surface landfill gas emissions, which is obviously an environmental concern, sort of a wider issue. Doing all that work with feedback, information into the next shoreline management plan. And obviously the shoreline management plan forms key evidence for local authorities when they're forming their statutory local plans and making other decisions like that. I'll just leave you with this one. Bit of a spelling mistake on there, but I don't know if these residents have come up with some new waste management technique for coastal areas. Thank you.